So we'll start with blackberrying after Sylvia Plath with the epigraph, "Blacker the berry, sweeter the juice." Children in the yard, in nothing but blackberries. Blackberries culled from the waist-high bushes, the blister bumps smashed down to seed and muck, then handprints on white button-downs and knee-highs. Blackberries pricked by thumbnail, an accidental murder, my own miscalculation of what the black skin could endure. Blackberries slit, then quickly squished, burying down the sides of my fingers, wet splints for the joints. I cannot tell if my mother's side requiem was for the fruit or my ruined clothes. Perhaps she lamented the deep red stain on my hands, mistaken for the first sample of womanhood. The next week, children exhausting from school buses, flocking to the bushes in the yards to blackberry again. Us little black girls crowning our fingers, blackberries for acrylic nails, for cat claws. The little black boys lugging the white plugs from the fruit center like grenade pins, throwing them across the yard before diving headfirst into grass. We could only fight temptation for so long. We grind the berries in our palms again, let the juice tattoo new veins down to elbow pit, lap up the pulp with our tongues. We paint our faces berry black, the careless dashes like freedom papers, releasing us from something we don't yet understand. The evening always ends in taste, the sweet syrup drying like blood on our lips. So a lot of this book is about Chicago, but some of it is also about the fact that my dad is an alcoholic and all of the ways that his addiction kind of shifted our family dynamics, and as a result, I had to be a sort of second mother as the eldest daughter, and mothering both my younger siblings and sometimes my parents as well. So this next poem is Mother, and it begins with the definition. Noun. 1, a female parent. 2, maternal tenderness or affection. 3, short for motherfucker, sometimes vulgar. 1, I have not yet been split by motherhood, have not yet felt my body become sick with itself, relinquished of its own parts. The lips that have latched onto me I needed in a different way. Yet I hurt the way a mother hurts, stretch marks like tendons, like ribbons piecing me together, heavy breasts like water balloons that never burst on contact, gifts I refuse to open. 2, my body knows something I don't, like how to take up space, how to fill a hole. I slip into the hands that call for me at dusk, when the hour knows no difference from mother or sister or daughter. Hips can bear the sins of others too. Perhaps this is what tips the scale, those morsels of sorry, and hold me, I collect from bathroom floors and bedsides. 3, the first time motherfucker felt like anything, it was my father calling my mother the name, thrown over his shoulder like salt after he spilled it in restaurants, an exit wound. My mother bore it painfully at first, then quietly, sort of like giving birth. Once you tear all the way through, everything feels like nothing, and nothing hurts. Let's go. After the car accident. I slowed traffic with my worry, kneeling and checking my car for damage. My palm on its feverish hood like a mother checking a child's temperature in the heat of the sun doubling its sickness. In the black paint's warped reflection, I could be mistaken for my father. This froggish position, squatting on my toes, my forehead becoming his in its rumpled state, even our concern biological, shared, right down to the way we squint at an injured thing, the way we have only temporary fixes for what is broken. I list the damages out loud, to no one, to the metronome of my hazard lights, to convince myself I've done it. This too is hereditary, struggling with admissions of guilt. On the phone with the insurance company, I begin to unbraid a legacy of blamelessness. Yes, I was operating my vehicle alone. The car was parked and empty when I hit it. This is just another version of the tree falling in the forest question. If no one saw me hit the car, did I do it? If my father never apologized on our old phone calls, did he truly wound me? The insurance agent on the phone is asking questions, following the printed script taped next to her computer screen. Is the car drivable? Are you hurt? I don't know which question I'm answering anymore. It doesn't matter. Yes. It comes pouring out of me like smoke from a car's underbelly, the hiss of air finding the path of least resistance. Yes, yes, yes. I'll do two more from this book. I'll do one for my brother. It's titled, If I Could Love Life Into Him, and it has an epigraph from Claudia Rankine's In Memory of Trayvon Martin that reads, on the tip of a tongue, one note following another is another path, another dawn, where the pink sky is the bloodshot of struck, of sleepless, of sorry, of senseless. Shush. My own name cuts through the night like ceiling fan blades, pulls me from a dream. And again, until my brother's silhouette fills my bedroom doorway like a murderer's. But he doesn't yet have the posture to kill, his preteen body still prototyping danger, laying bone and muscle like concrete. He can't sleep, so he roots his mattress from its frame, drags it across the carpeted hall into my room, one long shh as the mattress irons a path. On the floor beside me, his breathing stutters as if he is restarting from a nightmare. I tell him everything about nothing, how tonight's full moon spits white against my car in the driveway, how Chicago's snow will turn the empty tree branches to drooping mustaches in a matter of weeks. His body gives the tears away, all its shuddering, so I slink down beside him, become a second blanket. I am struck that it has been over a decade since I have held him, since he has cried in my arms. He peels his wet face from the front of my shirt, tilts it upward towards me to say something, and I wish I could see his eyes. I want to know if they are now pink skies, if what has always been clear is now the color of water that has washed the hands of a killer. And then I'll do the last poem in this book, and then two from Resting Bitch Face. Dear Moon, when the dark curtains for the bedroom came, I blacked you out like the night you fight in. Forgive me, but I'm still working through it in therapy. Lately, I've been so sudden with my decisions. Cut my braids out of my head a month early, put a deadline on a man's love. I'm leaving space for nothing but blame in the new season, and this here is no different. I never told you about the great hurt between us, me, 13, and thinking I needed you to speak back to me. Back then, I skipped my wishes to you like stones over water. I slept in the overhang of mornings that relieved your shift. I'm angry, I still don't know what to call the thing between us. Were you friend or sister, the first lover to leave when I became too much? I've surrendered to the half-truth. Men remind me of you. The mixed messages, you in my bed every night and nothing ever to say of it. My therapist says I'm projecting, but goes silent when I mention that you've been doing it to me my whole life. At night, I get moody and waiting, anxious for you to ask me how I've been, anxious enough to pay someone to ask me now instead. The harder and fuller truth, men have abandoned me and I never heard from you. I was a shadow of a wolf whimpering into your blank light. I didn't know that love was an ancestor of quietude, that you were still there. Of all things love, I'm still learning. Thank you. Okay, we'll switch over. And my last two poems will be from Resting Bitch Face. So this book is a lot about surveillance, all the different ways that women are sort of constantly watched in our society in particular. And so I'll read you the titular poem first, which kind of came into being because during the pandemic I was wearing masks, and in doing so I realized that men had stopped telling me to smile because they couldn't see the entirety of my face. And so in thinking about that, this poem sort of came into being. So it has an epigraph from the book Spill by Alexis Pauline Gumbs, which I think is incredible. And the epigraph reads, "How did you get here? What trumped up troop of slave ship sloop put you here on my doorstep in your nastiness?" Something about the set of my face says slave, cracks sharp in its stank and slits you uncomfortable. And what do you make of me again? In that gas station parking lot, in the grocery aisle in its fluorescence, when you tell me to smile for you. You too pretty to be frowning, makes the fugitive of me, shutters me closed for your business. You even smooth talk yourself into a lie, say smile and mean relax, mean open, mean peel back, mean lights, camera, action, put on a show for me. Last time I smiled for a man, my teeth sparked white in the dark of his bedroom like police lights in a rearview mirror. What could I afford with that currency besides his violence? Smiling has never bought me tenderness, never tendered me a love that let my face be bitch, and ain't that what you gon' call me anyways? Whether I thaw out for you or not, don't this always end the same? The bright you coax from my mouth, snuffed out as soon as I show it to you. Okay, and then the last poem I'll read. There is a sculpture studies poem series that runs throughout this book, and over time it moves from a sort of like third-person detached narrator that's sort of doing this observing, and then over time the I sort of reappears. And so this is one of the ones that's kind of towards the end of the book. It's a later one. So sculpture study number 6, Chicago, Illinois. And again, thank you for being here, and to the library and Michael for having me. The last time I watched its time lapse, the sunset was a slow and steady ambering. A fire waxed flat to the razored grass. And haven't all my lessons about fire bristled across the sky? I knew the word fire before I knew the colors that made it, knew its loyalty, the daily sear, the nightly put out, learned quickly that it didn't discriminate. The first 4th of July that I remember, I stood next to one of many cars parked like tally marks in an open field. Before a fireworks display, rows of brake lights neoned the grass. When the rocket sliced upwards and away from me, I felt safe. By now, I'd also known that heat had to come close to be felt, that fire whispered its confrontation. Then the boom came. When the string of light fractured outward, when the explosion arched down and fell back towards the earth, I watched it approach in terror. Like all things dangerous, here was a flame that reached for me with its fingers. Like all things cowardly, here was a flame that waited until it was inches away from my face to disappear.
I'll read some work from my first collection, Unto Dogs. this is it. You can find it at bookstores, also at walmart.com, allegedly. This book really focuses on themes around reproductive violence and the history of sterilization and the birth control pill trials in Puerto Rico. So you'll find a lot of that as well as some other stuff in this book. But I will read a poem that I think really dives into the themes. La Operación, AKA when he asks if I'm on birth control. It starts with a fact. Between the 1930s and the 1970s, 1/3 of the female population of Puerto Rico was sterilized, making this the highest rate of sterilization in the world. Fertility, a gift or a curse, dependent on skin color, or where one watches the stars from. The women of Puerto Rico are considered more animal than human. Mothering machines tucked into mountains. Enter America, a Dr. Frankenstein with less fervor and more genocidal tendencies. Tying tubes into knots, or not ever agains. A life sentence sentenced, but here lies no more life, so what is there to give? See, the curse be that the women of Puerto Rico hold so much passion in the plexus, Christ himself becomes a chorus of shudders each time our knees part. Say that line 5 times fast. Such a deep devotion to miracles, we cannot stop imitating them. Like hands, passing across the skin of the conga, honoring the ritual of creation so fully. Those imperialist parasites pass laws, govern bodies, to try and quiet the showy nature of God herself. And I once read an article about a biologist at Berkeley who said Puerto Rican women were the closest example of the perfect human that exists due to the mix of blood, sugar, salt. And maybe that's why America wanted to stop the breeding of a people it didn't regard as perfect or even as people, but more so a byproduct that overproduces. And I know this is not the answer to your question, but thank you. And I wasn't gonna do this poem, but I feel like, Taylor, because you shared a poem from your book, Resting Bitch Face, I cannot talk today. It is one of those days. You ever have them where like your mouth is like, we're not doing that today. Quiet down. Today of all days. But this poem is called Hija de la Gran Puta, and you'll find out what that means in a minute. Hija de la Gran Puta. Translation. Daughter of the greatest bitch. This is the term of endearment passed down from my mother and her mother, offered up like a herringbone, like it was sworn in the pages of a familial holy book. When I was a little puta, I mean girl, I mean too young to know the difference, I thought it all one long word, a necronomicon of sorts that would conjure a bitch queen mother from the potholes on our street, a wild-haired temptress with patent-heeled paws, a lipstick shade as dark as the 4th day's blood, and a mole painted right above her dark, waiting mouth. What I've always wanted to know is, who is this great bitch? Most high bitch? God bitch? What of myself would I see echoed in the negative of her eyes? And if she were to meet death unwelcomed, like all the bitches that I love do, will I then be called to ascend the throne? Be cast unto the darkest side of the moon only to return when bitches of a particular kind of wicked summon me? Or if I am someday called to sit at the paws of Mami Puta, will she lovingly encourage my insolent nature, mother me the way mortal mothers never could? What I do know is, if there were ever a legacy to live towards, this I would consider the most fitting. Thank you. I made it through that poem without stuttering. I'll read one more from this collection, and then we'll get into some new work. I just like reading this poem because, I'm gonna be honest, I was very, very proud of it. It's only got 3 words, and I was like, that's cool. It's the 3 R's of American Medical Experimentation, 1956. Rabbits, rats, Ricans. Thank you. I do have copies of this book for sale with me. I don't know how that works in the library, but if you need to meet me in the parking lot to do some back deal deals, we can do that. Hold on, there we go. I'm currently working on a collection. Like Michael said, I'm from South Lorraine. I have to be specific about that, because if people hear Lorraine, they're like, oh, okay, some like cornfields, there's like a jail out there, I'm pretty sure. South Lorraine is very different. It's a little insular community that is mostly Puerto Rican, and I'm currently working on a collection that talks about like growing up in this place, the history of it, how all those damn Puerto Ricans got there. Yeah, so these are a few poems from that, and then we'll do our thing here, folks. I don't want to read that one first. Hold on. Okay, this one. This poem is called Oakwood Plaza. The wind opens its arms, and I am a city without a skyline. Or a town in a dead stranger's clothes. That's right, a town wearing a nameplate that claims something more. Like city, but I am so town. Keep my name out your mouth and in an Ohio drive-thru. Either way, I'm a mouth-howling gossip and jest, calling myself a city built on a river dark as spoiled grease. All my lovers are teeth, oxidized and patient. I leave them abandoned at gas stations and Taco Bells. Work a street, no corner, in daddy's two big boots and mommy's purple contacts. The moth that lives in my hair chews through it, each strand holding secrets as deep as a secret. I am a shopping plaza of desire. Except in this city, the shopping plaza is demolished because it came to the party dressed as a carnival. But the carnival came dressed as a shooting, and so. I came to the party dressed as a charred tortilla dripping with butter and salt. I came to the party dressed as a struggle meal. I came to the party dressed as a struggle. I came to the meal dressed as a struggle. I came to the struggle dressed as a meal. I'm at the party struggling for a meal. But there are no meals, because the only grocery store was in that plaza, and so I eat my deepest breath and become the wind. Thank you. I have to give credit to that last line, though. My best friend kind of came up with it, because she said her dad called her and was like, what did you eat for dinner tonight? And in true broke for fashion, she was like, a deep breath. And I was like, it's sad out here. Fuck capitalism. Okay, I'll read this one. So a lot of these poems, the titles are just places in Lorraine. And that's it. This one's called Key Foods. The corner store up the block, the one that serves alcapurrias and pernil sandwiches, is still there. The one that has Boricua shit everywhere is still there. But it's owned by Palestinians now. And it's crazy, because the food still tastes Boricua made. I guess stolen land all tastes the same after a while. Thank you. Okay, last one. Thank you all for being here again. That's super cool of you. Taylor and I appreciate it. And the library appreciates it, right? They do. I can see it. This is called 32nd Street. It is the late 90s and everyone is still alive. And this is what I mean when I say take me back. And like fuck a weekend in Miami, I mean take me back to the days before death came and did a street sweep. I mean, who did we wrong to curse us like this? And anyway, we were just kids on porches stuck in the smooth of summer. Or on bikes, all explorer type, traversing parts of the city our parents couldn't find out about. I mean, we spent most afternoons at the Quick Mart on the corner, scraping a few dollars together for some honey barbecue twists and coconut sodas. Or at the park on the other side of the block, watching basketballs and the boys that dribbled them flit along the sticky courts, hoping the chip crisp twists of our baby curls and the glisten of freshly Carmexed lips would be enough to seduce the one with the lineup of a demigod. And the park was so full of life back then, with all the Kool-Aid-lipped kids hanging from the monkey bars, and the little custom Hondas with subs competing to be the supplier of this afternoon's soundtrack. Between trumpets crying out for a home they could not afford to return to, and the hollow drums fighting to stay heard over the rumble of hungry bellies. And yet the loudest sound in attendance was laughter, until it wasn't. I mean, take me back to the days when she was still here, and 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 she was still here. I mean, why everybody I love gotta be so good at becoming ghosts? I mean, if I could just stand on the corner of this poem forever, I would. Thank you.
How did you get started writing?
I started keeping journals when I was younger, like late middle school into high school. And I don't know if there are any other writers in the room, but have you ever like done some sort of writing that doesn't require like much of anything and then you realize that you're doing too much? Yeah, that was me in all of my journals and diaries, and I was always trying to tell some sort of elaborate story, and I was like, maybe it's because you want to do something more than just this. And that's kind of how I figured that I wanted to be some kind of writer. I went through my terrible Tumblr, poetry phase, shout out to her. And I was like, oh, so like putting writing out in the world is also cool. Maybe not these, but at some point, some better things. And so all of those things I think drove me to go into undergrad to kind of think about writing, but I thought I was gonna be writing short stories and novels mainly. But at the end of undergrad, I took an ekphrastic poetry class, which was poetry that we were just writing about visual art the entire semester. We were in art museums, we were just doing all this sorts of crazy stuff. And during that semester, I was like, oh, I'm still writing stories. I'm just doing it in this very different way, in this way where I can kind of like obsess over language differently. And that's kind of what changed me over and switched me over to poetry. And so here I am still kind of with poetry at the forefront. So that's what my journey has looked like.
I did the same thing. I feel like most writers, we got in our like Harriet the Spy bag, and we're carrying journals everywhere. And so same thing, except I thought I was writing song lyrics. I was like, oh, I'm gonna be a rapper and I'm gonna marry DMX. Glad that didn't work out. But then I realized, I was like, oh, maybe, as a writer though, the overhead cost is very minimal. You just need a notebook and a pen. And so growing up poor, I was like, tight, I can acquire those things on my own. I don't have to ask my parents. So yeah, I would write stories, song lyrics that eventually I was like, these might be poems. And just continued in that kind of vein. Did have children at a pretty young age in my early 20s, and so that kind of diverted me away from poetry and from writing for a long while. But as they started to get older and I was like, oh, free time, this is nice. I found myself like going back to those notebooks and being like, well, this is trash, but I can probably do better now. And then that was it. I actually came to a poetry workshop here in this room. It was put on by Literary Cleveland, and it was taught by Keisha Nicole Foster. If you're from Cleveland, you probably know that name. And it was incredible, and she was like, yeah, I work for this nonprofit, 12 Literary Arts. Why don't you come on down? And so I did, and I started teaching with them, and then it was just like, yeah, poetry all day, every day since then.
All right. Let's see. Taylor, you were talking about thinking about how you would write novels and short stories. There is a prosaic quality to your writing as well, at least in the book that we have here. Can you talk about sort of adding those prose poem-like qualities, how you work in that form, maybe a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think my fiction background definitely influences how narrative my writing continues to be, for sure. And probably also the ekphrastic background too. I think thinking about or sort of writing a thing or writing a story that always has some sort of like visual beginning, then I think in part becomes this practice of also like describing the thing or interacting with the visual thing, and so the visual kind of always becomes important. And I think world building, right, as a fiction sort of convention, is like way important in my writing in ways that maybe like all poets are not thinking about world building, for example. But I think I've also been thinking a lot about like what I call like camera work of a poem, especially in prose poetry. I think I think prose poems often operate in similar ways that films do, in that we're always sort of thinking about where we're directing a reader's eye, and it's like, okay, this is like a cutscene, and then we're panning away, and what are we looking at now, and how zoomed in are we, how zoomed out are we? I think when I'm thinking about prose poems in particular, because I'm not thinking about other things that you think about in lineated poems, like we're not thinking about line breaks, we're not thinking about enjambment, we're not thinking about those things, we're considering other ways to create surprise, and I think that sort of camera work is the way that I think about surprise in the space of the prose poem, and also the shape of it. It's kind of like a little film or a little still that you're looking at too. So I think prose poems and film are kind of like this for me in my mind, and that's kind of how I'm processing those as I work through it. And Resting Bitch Face, surprise, surprise, is like 75% prose. And I think the book after that will probably be hybrid, and it'll probably have poems and little essays and also probably short stories in it. So, yeah.
And I'm really glad you sort of said about the prose poem. You're basically removing some of the typical poetry aspects that most people would think about, and it forces you to write in a different way, right? And you said you're going to be writing a book that's novels, poetry, and nonfiction all in one. So I always mention I wish more books like that would come back. I miss those books. It's from like where every writer would just throw everything they had into a single volume. I love that. Stephanie with Unto Dogs, similarly, the use of the screenplay. Can I call it the screenplay? Yeah. Can you talk about, and again, world building is also huge in your book as well. Can you talk about how you utilize the screenplay and maybe the fantastic or fabulistic tendencies in your book and how that came about?
I will just give a deep, heartfelt shout out to the technique device of magical realism and how like that informs a lot of like Latin American writing. And so as a like student of that, I was like, oh, cool, world building, yeah, like we can create fantasy. It does feel a little sci-fi to me at times because it, deals a lot with spirituality and like medicine and science. So that was cool. The screenplays came about because I was just looking for like a different form. I think what really drew me to poetry in the end was like the ability to be playful in it. Like, yes, there are rules. Yes, there are forms, but like there doesn't have to be. You can throw that all out the window if you want, which is what I love. And so the screenplays felt like another entry point into some sort of world, but like this framework that I was like, everybody will recognize this. And like it gives me ways to incorporate like dialogue and maybe like set the scene without having to give it all, I can just put like exterior. Then you can put like a character's name and then the dialogue that they said. And so it felt like a nice, concise way to kind of, like you said, like snapshot and that camera work. I'm gonna be thinking about that for like days now. Because that's, I think, what I was trying to do, but didn't have the way to like articulate it and frame it. And so thank you for that gift today. But essentially, yeah, what those poems were trying to do was set up this scene in a very like concrete way that everyone would kind of like recognize and be able to dive in.
Okay, anybody have any questions? I don't know if I missed any hands. Yep. For recording purposes, if you could speak into the microphone.
I guess maybe like one or two questions, if that's cool. What are you guys reading right now?
I just finished the book Original Kink by Juby Ariola Headley, which was incredible. It's a book of poetry. And right now, I like always carry the books that I'm reading with me. So I just started. Yeah, it's so good so far. Dispatches from Puerto Nowhere by Robert Lopez, which has been really great. It's nonfiction, and they're like these very sort of small bursts of essay that have been really incredible. So yeah.
I've been getting into like just little piece by piece, poem by poem. Zach Savage, who is here in Cleveland, his new book Momently, which has these like fantastic genius lines in them, and they're very like the poems, there's like the caesura, they're very short, they're no more than like these 3 prosy stanzas, and the amount of like restrictiveness that Zach was able to put in. Because I feel like with this book, there was no restrictions. It was chaos. It was balls to the wall. I feel like when people ask me about this book, compare it to that meme of Charlie Day from It's Always Sunny with like the red thread and all the pictures. I was like, this is all connected. And so what I love about Zach's book is it's like there's just so much breathability in it and so much like restriction and like keeping things very tight. And so I'm kind of, interested in exploring what that looks like for me now. So shout out that book. And, is there any like good fiction that I've just been reading? No, it's been a lot of historical, like boring research books. But it's still interesting and fascinating, but.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So both your work is talking about places where you're from. So there's like this historical aspect. Kind of naturally leads you into like thinking about the role of time in poetry. And like you were talking about like red threads kind of connecting ideas. So I'm wondering, how are you guys creating like lateral connections versus like past connections inside your work right now? Like, are you noticing like certain like things you consistently do when you're working through a poem?
That's good. That was good. I'll take a stab at it. Time, yeah. I feel like with this work, especially because it deals so much with history and historical figures who have passed, bringing them into the present. So that's why the screenplays were cool. It was like, I can have a conversation with this dead person, essentially, but it makes sense, and I don't have to do any sort of like legwork of like bringing them back. It was like, we're just here. And so I think warping time in that way is fun with poetry, and that it allows you to do that, I think, a little more seamlessly, whereas fiction, I feel like you have to build up to it, and then you have to like somehow get you out of there. Where poetry, it's like we can like sort of throw you here and then throw you there, and then, which I think is what excites me the most about it. So I feel like playing with time is definitely like a part of my work, even with the second collection, going back to like memories of hometown, but like what does that place look like now? And my like bestest friends, we've all been friends since we were like 7, and we all grew up in the same neighborhood, so we're still able to have these very present conversations, and the trauma and the beauty is still happening in real time, so there's always the inspiration in time doesn't stop.
I think the like genre of poetry in particular is special to me because I think, we're kind of like the cool guys that get to cartwheel between fiction and nonfiction. And typically like the poetry starts pretty close to the self, and you kind of get to decide how close it stays to you and how far you move it away, right? And I think that's also a time thing too, like the ability to kind of start here from a sort of present moment, or a moment that's sort of pretty close to the now, and then getting to kind of decide like how far you wanted to move away even in history, right? Or how you want to sort of like, what sort of historical conversations you might want to have from that moment that might be very present too. And I'm also thinking about lateral connections. I think one of the ways that I find myself drawing lateral connections is putting myself always in conversation with other writers that are writing right now. So you'll see that a lot in the epigraphs, right? I'm always sort of like having those sorts of conversations or incorporating lines or things from other people's work, because I think that's also a way to kind of build a web, or even a way to kind of lead a reader through a sort of like lineage that you're working within. Like, I got here because I've encountered these other things too, and I think that's a way, as a writer and then also for a reader, to kind of draw a map. Yeah.
We have a question back here.
Thank you very much for your poetry. Kind of about connections and location. Also, I'm a writer also, and I went to UAB for 2 years, so there's a little connection there. But my question is about location and your research on the places like Chicago and Lorraine that you were talking about. Is there anything extraordinary or peculiar or special that you found while researching these places?
I think for me, in particular, when thinking about Chicago, the most extraordinary stuff that I found was like not the typical historical textbook things. It was, I think the best things that I looked at while thinking about Chicago was like the photography of Gordon Parks, for example. I was very curious in the sort of like archival things that are just like this, like the study of being human, like just study of humans. And I think photographs and photography are just kind of like one of the most exciting things to me, the most exciting ways that we kind of study other people. And so I think for me, that was like the most extraordinary research that I encountered when thinking about Chicago, was just all of these photographs of Black people in everyday life, which, as I say that out loud, I can't really think of a lot of places where I encounter a lot of photographs of just Black people kind of existing in everyday life, besides like people's personal Instagram, but that's just not something that I think I encounter a lot in this world. I'm thinking about magazines, I'm thinking about like all the places that we sort of see pictures, and that's not something that I think is very common, right? So that was also just, I think, a really life-altering study for me too, to just see those photos, and to think about Chicago and the way that people just were just existing. Yeah.
I think for me, it's just these like little moments in history, these certain things like finding out that Lorraine used to be called mouth of the Black River before it was named Lorraine, and I was like, that's badass. Or where I grew up, South Lorraine, was actually called La Colonia, so the colony, which I thought, I was like, ironic, since Puerto Rico is a colony, and I was like, they do that on purpose. And the businesses, and like, yeah, seeing photographs of like what Puerto Rican Boulevard in South Lorraine looked like before they kind of broke apart the businesses and like redistricted the neighborhoods. But just, yeah, seeing like a lot of the photos or like reading about these different businesses, and some of them are still there, like Ortiz Groceries or Roman's Groceries and Rainbow Bakery. And like seeing how those sort of things, like they used to be owned, like that poem Key Foods, it talks about they used to be owned by Puerto Ricans, and like a lot of those stores are owned by Palestinians now, which I'm like, the way that they kind of like shift hands, but if you walk in, there's still like Puerto Rican flags everywhere, and like the stuff we hang in our rearview mirrors. So it's, just a lot of like small moments in history, or certain words or turns of phrases that I'm like really interested in, and finding out how to incorporate those in the new work. That's been, I think, the most fascinating thing, and seeing how ingrained like the identity of Puerto Rico is in this neighborhood. Like, it's cold, it's all the way up north, so many hours away, and still it feels very like, visiting Puerto Rico now, I'm like, oh, this feels familiar. It's just warm here.
Do you have any other questions? I miss a hand. No. Do you ever feel pressure writing about, say, a place like Chicago or Lorraine? Does that ever?
I don't feel pressure. It's work that I like doing. I think now I'm thinking about and writing a lot about just like the Midwest kind of in general, and just how strange and also just creepy she is. But I think the sort of like pastoral work is so fascinating. I think the study of land is so fascinating, and it's sort of like, when you start to think about it, it's ingrained in everything. Like, so many scary movies that we know and love sort of like capitalize on the creepiness of the Midwest, for example. Like, that's a part of, and scary movies are like very much a part of like American pop culture. And so I think it's really fascinating to think about how something like the land, or something like the Midwest, becomes this kind of like, silhouette in the doorway that kind of just haunts all of these different things that are very much ingrained in our society. So I don't think it's pressure. I think it's always there. We just kind of have to like find it.
I don't, yeah, pressure. I mean, there's definitely a little bit of pressure to like do right. I think because the experience I'm writing about and from is kind of very specific, and I'd like the most famous writer to come out of Lorraine is Toni Morrison, which we don't have to, no other writer has to come out of Lorraine. We've done it. But you know, like she wrote in this very sort of, yeah, like Midwest, Black Ohio aesthetic. And I'm hoping to do the same thing with my work as like the Midwest Puerto Rican aesthetic, which obviously, like besides Chicago, isn't very studied or written about or anything like that. But you're right, there is something about the Midwest. It's like this creepiness, this, the aesthetics of like sort of rural, sort of country. Like if you've ever been to South Lorraine, we kind of have Southern accents, which is weird. It's all, you know, like the Midwest has this very Southernness to it, which you would think it would have more of an East Coast vibe, but no. So to me, it's like very, very fascinating. Yeah, this like rural, almost like Appalachian, like hillbilly aesthetic, but it's also very diverse, which people don't often realize. Like I think, especially the major cities in Ohio, people are like, oh, Ohio's just all cornfields and like weird white people, and you're like, and then you come and you're like, this is what Ohio is, like, you know, the room that we're in right now, the folks who are here. And so it doesn't feel like pressure, but it feels like a lot of excitement to be, you know, a part of the group of writers who are sort of bringing these aesthetics and these conversations to the bigger literary canon.
Okay. Let's see, more towards the end. Now, I want to talk about reading your poetry or performing your poetry, however you like to refer to it. Do you like that aspect of being a poet? And has your style changed the more you've done it? Because you've both read a lot lately, right?
I love reading poems. And part of it is because I love listening to poems and the sort of like different life that they have in the air, that they don't necessarily have on the page. And the spoken element is you know, the origin, right? That's kind of where we come from. And so I love it. I think it should be a thing that poets practice regularly. I don't know if my style has necessarily changed. I will say that I think more about the performance of a poem in the like revision process now than I ever have. Like I think about the way something's gonna sound being read out loud more than I like ever cared about years ago. And part of that is in Resting Bitch Face, there's like a portion of the book that starts to think about the weird ways that people can kind of like continue to haunt us after they've like not in our lives anymore. And one of that is like all of these audio snippets and things that people can kind of leave us, voicemails, voice notes, those sorts of things. And there are poems that kind of incorporate those types of things. And there's a poem that like I read in a voicemail-y voice. And so I was thinking about performance in particular when thinking about that book. And so now I think about it even more. But yeah, I don't know if my style has necessarily changed, but it's become part of the writing process, I think, more than it ever has as a result of the sort of projects that I've been working on and the things that have kind of crept in. Yeah.
Yeah, I think about sometimes reading it out loud when I write it. Like I'll notice that I'll give a poem to someone and they're like kind of editing it and they're cutting it out certain things and they're like, because this phrasing like looks weird on the page, and I'm like, yeah, but when I read it out loud, it makes sense to me. So I think performance has become sort of a bigger part of it. I'm also, besides a poet, a stand-up comedian. I've been doing it for like a year now. And I feel like that has informed a lot of the way I read or perform. I want to make it more interactive. Like I want folks to like be like, we're in this together. So I try to make it interactive if I can, or like shout people out or call things out. I think with, crowd work is what they call it in comedy, but I think I've tried to incorporate that into poetry too, because I know sometimes poetry readings can be very like stiff or monotone, or that's the sort of stereotype that they have. So just trying to make things a little more communal. I think people, when they think about writing, they think of it as this, oh, that's this very solitary act. I'm alone in my room with my madness and my little bird. But it's not. I mean, even when you are writing alone, you still are in conversation with other writers, you're in conversation with history, you're in conversation with experiences that you've had. And so I think performing is a way that you get to like feel that community of writing in a much more like present and vibrant and sort of brilliant way. And so, yeah, anytime anybody wants me to read poems, I'll show up and I'll read them. Just let me know. You're cooking breakfast? I'll come read you poems.
Okay. And lastly, you've talked a little bit about your future book projects. Do you have anything else going on upcoming?
Resting Bitch Face comes out fall of next year, and just writing that multi-genre hybrid monster on the Midwest in the meantime.
Working on that book, finishing school, applying to MFA programs for more work. Also, though, there's more poetry going on this weekend. If you're in the mood, I do host a weekly variety show. It's free. It's in the Clark Fulton neighborhood at Dunlap's Corner Bar. It goes from 8 p.m. to 9:30. We will have you home and in bed before 10, I promise. But this weekend is very exciting. We have, first, the variety show always features a comedian, a poet or writer, and a musician. And it's cool, and they do these short sets, and it's free, and it's just like a great way to see all of the great and brilliant artists we have here in this city. Sometimes, though, we have special guests from outside of Cleveland, like this weekend. Our show is gonna feature Elijah Nevels, who's like a 19-year-old up-and-coming comedian in the city. He's like getting national recognition. He's super, super funny. We also will have the band Barricade Baby, who is a local like leftist, like Afro-Boricua punk band. So that's super cool. And our featured poet is none other than Neuro-Rican poet who's sitting in the back corner there. Bonafide Rojas came all the way from New York to read some poets for the folks in Cleveland, or to read some poems for the folks in Cleveland. So that's coming up tomorrow, 8 p.m. You can find us on Instagram, or if you want more details, find me, I'm here. But that's like, those weekly shows have been like a big part of what I've been working on lately with my co-host. And so, yeah, just getting to create a stage and a space for other artists to share their work. That's also what I'm like really excited about. My own work, of course, but like being able to support the greater art scene here in Cleveland.
I like having writers read with like the cool people, right? That's always good. If there are no other questions, I think that'll be it then today. So thank you again, Taylor and Stephanie. That was really great.